What's a dictionary writer's favourite word? What does it mean when a word is skunked? Has the internet meant it's easier to get a word into the dictionary? And is artificial intelligence making writing dictionaries easier or much, much harder? All these questions answered and more with expert help in this special Rob Words. Nouns. Oh, hello there. You just caught me reading a dictionary in my spare time on a bench. But have you ever wondered how you actually go about writing one of these things? Well, in a very special Rob Words, you are about to find out, because I have been chatting to the marvellous Peter Sokolowski, who is one of the writers or lexicographers of the USA's most influential and best-selling dictionary, Merriam-Webster. He also presents their Word of the Day podcast. Now, I find Peter fascinating. I think you will too. So please enjoy this deep dive into how we go about recording the English language. You know, what I imagine the first question you get asked, particularly when you do a podcast called Word of the Day, is, and you must have a stock answer for this. What's your favourite word?
I do have a stock answer because I can never think clearly about it. I actually think it's a tough question. It's a very hard question for someone who is very analytical about language. Then you don't have the same kind of emotional attachments all the time to words. I do like the word sesquipedalian because it's fun to say and it's got a fun meaning, and it sometimes corresponds to what people think of as dictionary editors, which is, by the way, not really true at all, that people go around speaking very long Latinate words all the time. That's absolutely not true. But it's a fun word, and once you hear it, once you learn it, you kind of remember it, and I think that's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely satisfying to hear and to see. So if you had to, I presume you didn't write the definition for sesquipedalian.
No. In fact, though, you bring up a point. I want to revise it because we actually do not define it as a noun. So we define it as, I think, given to the use of long words or something like that. But I think it is. I think there is evidence out there that it's used as a noun. So one given to the use of long words.
So you can be a sesquipedalian.
That's
rather
right.
than
And
just being
the classic test is to say, they're a real blank, they're a real sesquipedalian. And if it works that way and it makes sense, it's never going to be a very common word, but I think it's one of those words that we define as an adjective quite properly. But I think it has had enough of a functional shift over the years, over the decades, that's a word that one is likely to encounter as a noun. And so we need to just tweak that definition just a tiny little bit to account for that. And that gives you some insight into the way we think about things, which is to always think about that subtle change. I mean, the fact is, semantically, it is the same, but an adjective and a noun are different things. And the dictionary is there to kind of take a census of the language and report on the usage. And I haven't looked at this recently, but I think I remember thinking a couple of years ago, boy, that really should be a noun. And it's one of those things that's on the back burner. It's not an urgent thing. The English language will move on whether we call sesquipedalian a noun or not. But I do think that ultimately catching up with the revisions and with the language and with the way that the language has changed over time is, in fact, our mission. It's our job. It's what we have to do. And it's not always so important to get it, that day. That kind of fast editing is actually not always a good way to measure a dictionary, because language changes so fast that there are things that happen that come and go, and it's hard for the dictionary to kind of be a fixed object when the language is a moving object.
It's also controversial stuff, isn't it? Changes in meaning of words. I mean, people are still fighting very hard against the more modern use of literally, for example. And what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, that to me it's a complicated story in the sense that my initial response is people who hate the non-literal use of literally are people who care deeply about language, and so immediately I recognize we share this interest, we share that concern for language. However, the mechanics of the language are such that there is a kind of what is sometimes called semantic bleaching that takes place. And that, like with etymological fallacy, we sometimes are selective about the ones that we complain about. And so literally by the letter is often, meaning by the letter, literally meaning that, is often used in this sort of hyperbolic way that, in a sentence, I literally died laughing. The function of the word literally in that sentence is only to kind of increase the intensity of
Yeah.
the irony that because you didn't die. And so, in other words, it's no longer bearing any semantic weight whatsoever. It is only there for hyperbole. It's only there for the purposes of intensity, adding intensity. And so, if that word has what you might call low lexical intensity, if that word is not carrying meaning in that sentence, as in he read the rules and regulations literally, in that kind of sentence, then what happens is over time, the word itself gets bleached of meaning, that the meaning is draining from that word. And that becomes one of those words that is bleached over time. And there are other words like this. I mean, no one complains about fabulous, and fabulous meaning excellent or wonderful. And no one really says, well, that can only be applied to a fable, because that's what the word means. Nobody complains about marvelous or even the word very. I had a very good lunch. It's a very good sandwich or some very good movie, something like that. But very etymologically, of course, is vrai, is the French word meaning true. And if you just said, oh, it was a very good movie, you're not really speaking of philosophical truth, right? You're just adding emphasis or intensity to something else. So that I feel that with literally, if we step back a little bit and recognize the mechanics of language have allowed for greater expression using this word, and that when it is used in its original sense, in its literal sense, it's usually quite clear. So there's a long answer, but my answer is not to laugh or sneer or argue. My answer with this is always to make common cause with someone who cares enough about language to care about the usage of that word. And what I would just basically say is apply that care more evenly across the language. And if you choose not to use that word in that way, there is absolutely no reason that I should encourage you to stop. I'm not the police of language, and nor is anyone else. A good editor, by the way, is someone who might correct some of those only if they draw attention to themselves and might distract from the actual meaning or the argument of your sentence. And I think that's an interesting thing to remember also, that there are, I'll sort of die for your right to use literally in a figurative sense, but I'll also recognize that, a convention such as a split infinitive, for example, or a terminal preposition, which are utterly un-English rules and have nothing to do with any kind of natural grammar of the English language. However, they can be distracting because of generations of teaching that they are bad style in some form or another. So I can also see a kind of a usage argument for avoiding such such constructions if they draw attention to themselves and therefore away from the bigger point of your writing. We want writing to be transparent and clear and easy to read.
Yeah, clarity is the key thing, right, with communication. So do you ever feel, as a lexicographer, any sort of duty to prevent words, I think it's called being skunked, to prevent words getting skunked, where they develop an extra meaning that actually renders the word itself redundant because you don't know which of the two meanings are actually being implied by it. I think one of the good examples is bemused, which is increasingly used, I think, in the United States. I actually haven't heard this back home for me in the UK. I haven't heard it elsewhere, but I gather this is a phenomenon in the US where bemused is being used to mean amused rather than, I suppose, confused or confounded. Right. In Merriam-Webster, do you list both of those meanings?
Oh, of course, yeah. No, I mean we have to, because our job is not in the first instance to pass judgment, but to record the facts of language. The way I look at it is there are two kinds of facts about language in the dictionary. There's the lexical fact. Here's the conventional spelling of this word. Here's the conventional phonetics pronunciation of this word. Here's the conventional meanings of this word. But then there's the cultural facts. Is this word archaic? Is it obsolete? Is it offensive? Is it, is it chiefly British, as we say, chiefly Brit? Is it only used in Southern American English? So that kind of usage information actually is just a cultural guide. Part of the role of the dictionary is to prevent the user from embarrassing themselves or from offending others, right? And so in this case, you have a word that is skunked. And I'm sure, I don't know offhand what the labeling is, but I'm sure there's a note at this entry that basically says, here's a word that originally meant this for 400 or 500 years and has been slipping in print and in common usage into this other way, so that if you use it in this newer way, you are likely to be criticized by those who care about the older way. If you go ahead and use it that way, we're not, again, the traffic cops, but we are there to provide you the facts. And I'd like to think of usage as the manners of language, so that, again, to prevent you from embarrassing yourself or offending others. And a lot of times it really is more about good kind of guidance for writing and editing. So a word like irregardless, which people love to hate, and it's obviously kind of a silly word for people who care about language and pay attention to language. For someone who's learned English, they might recognize more quickly even that it has this sort of double negative that is nonsensical. Nevertheless, the word appears in print. It does appear in print, and that is why it's in our dictionary. So we present it with the linguistic facts. Here's how it's spelled. Here's what it means. But then there's the cultural fact. And the usage note at our entry for irregardless simply says, use regardless instead. I mean, so in other words, we do give advice. That is part of the role of the dictionary, even though some people seem to think that we're either kind of a supreme court of language or a traffic cop. We're actually neither of those things. We are sort of a professional service that will allow you to make informed decisions. And that information is sometimes about the history of a word, but sometimes it's about the sort of present fluidity of its state. And if that's the state of a word, which could remain that way forever, then maybe that's a word, for example, in this case, this is a word that I simply will never use. Because first of all, in my head, I have to get straight which version is the right one or the one I really prefer. And by the time I've done that, I realize, this word is skunked. It's just too bad, and that happens to some words. And so all the dictionary can do is be as clear as possible and give the best advice that we can. But me personally, as a writer, I will just steer around that word to a different word.
Has that always been the case, that dictionaries are recorders of the language and not, as you put it, language police? Or has there ever been a stage in the development of dictionaries, as far back as Samuel Johnson or Noah Webster, where the intention has been to dictate usage?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Your premise is completely correct. I mean, that was the original idea. And I think, as with the complex answer about semantic bleaching, I think the argument about prescription and description is much more complex than the sort of straw man argument that you might see on Twitter or something. Because the function of a dictionary is primarily prescriptive. You look up a word up. You look up a word to see how it's spelled, and there's the right. I mean, I'm part of the Scripps National Spelling Bee program in the United States, and the dictionary is literally the arbiter of whether the word is correct or incorrect. So calling balls and strikes is what the dictionary does. However, the research for the dictionary and the approach to presenting that research can be prescriptive or descriptive. It's absolutely true that both Johnson and Webster initially thought, I am going to finally map out the English language. I'll write everything down, and then it'll be concrete in black and white, and the term that Johnson used was fix. And he didn't mean repair, he meant make permanent, right? And I will fix the language. And in both cases, to their great credit, by the time they were done with their odyssey, with their journey, they both realized this language is untamable. This language is uncontrollable, and the best I can do is a little snapshot of the language in a moment in time. And that brings us to the sort of the Webster tradition of what I would call a synchronic dictionary, a dictionary that records the current active use of American English. That's our mission. Very different from the mission of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a diachronic dictionary across time, which is measuring 1,000 years of literary English. And so those are two different missions. We do conduct the research in very similar ways, of course, and we're great colleagues, but we have kind of different expressions of that research. So yes, dictionaries often have been marketed in the 20th century as being kind of, we're the right ones, we're the old-fashioned ones, and kind of wagging your finger and being the traffic cop. The Merriam-Webster tradition has been kind of in the forefront of a more descriptive approach. And initially that was called a radical decision, but I would think that that kind of decision is ultimately the only decision that is tolerable, the only decision that stands up over time, because you can't fix a language that's a living language, right? So that even though it's true that language is always changing, we can always kind of do our best to keep up. We will be watching the language kind of in the rearview mirror, if you know what I mean. We're sort of seeing it a little bit as it goes past, because we are not coining words, we're not inventing usages, we're recording them, which means we need a body of evidence to see. The fastest a term ever has been entered into a Merriam-Webster dictionary, unsurprisingly, was the term COVID-19. Which was literally 34 days between its coinage by the World Health Organization and its entry into our online dictionary. And that is record speed. Most words take decades or longer to be entered in the dictionary.
That's something I wanted to ask you. You know, now that we do have online dictionaries, I say now as if we've just developed them, we've had them for a while. But I suppose a limitation in the past for the dictionary and what would make it in and would not, or at least a consideration, was that we've got to get all this down on paper. Our dictionary can't be too big.
Absolutely.
But now we have online versions of the dictionary. Are more words making it into the dictionary? And is the test a little easier to pass?
Oh, absolutely. No, your premise is correct. In fact, I would argue, I'm not sure what's behind me here, I would argue that one of the primary, this blue one here, one of the primary motivations for almost every editorial decision in that dictionary, except for one that I can think of, was made to make it shorter, to make the entries shorter, to make the sections shorter, to make it fit. One part of the sort of Webster tradition is it's clear the company always tried to keep the dictionary into one single volume. We didn't want to expand as the OED had done. And partly that's just a purely commercial, practical decision. And so things like the cost of paper actually matter. Merriam-Webster actually invented a font during my time here in order to squeeze more lines into the page.
Is it a really narrow font, or is it
no,
really
it's a little.
short
It's actually
one?
paradoxically, it's a bit wider and squished so that you could your eye actually reads these letters. If you have a copy after 2003 of the Collegiate Dictionary, the letters look like Times New Roman. They look quite conventional, but actually they've been squished ever so slightly. But the descenders and ascenders, the P's and the Q's and the K's and the L's, they all are lowered so that they don't crash into each other on the page. So literally every decision, right down to the typesetting, was about cramming stuff on the page. Being released from that is an unbelievable liberty, and it will take a generation to untie the knot of all of the elliptical things we did in the past to make dictionaries shorter. Some of those decisions we're just going to essentially throw away and make some of those definitions that are so elliptical and short as to be nonsensical, and expand them, and just simply write in plain English and write a nice, easy to understand definition. Which was simply not possible in the previous technology. And so dictionaries are becoming easier to read. They're easier to access online as well. And also one, simple thing that just makes so much sense is what we call a restatement. So a lot of these definitions will have a kind of a simple technical definition with a colon, and then kind of a restatement, but in less technical language of the same idea, So that, again, we were never permitted in the old days to restate a definition. Once it was stated clearly with the most technical language, we were considered, that was the definition. And some of them, if you look at them in the old unabridged dictionaries, I don't know what they mean. You have to look up two other words from the definition to get there, especially scientific terms. And now we're allowed with space to expand and also to add examples. And example sentences are so important for a dictionary project. Especially for idioms and for collocations and for the very basic use of a dictionary, the way I use it myself for French, for example, a language that I have learned, but I don't always know what is the preposition that follows this verb. Is it is it to, or is it from, or is it with, whatever. And so that's what I want from a dictionary. Most people who look up words a lot in dictionaries are looking up words that they already use, that they already know. They're looking for nuance, they're looking for syntax, they're looking for maybe etymology or history, but also those collocations, to know that a word like vitriol is almost always connected to the word political. I mean, that kind of thing that we can now ascertain quite quickly using corpus linguistics is exactly the kind of information that dictionaries should have. And now we have more room to express that kind of idea. Also, of course, but we can give audio pronunciations, which is, priceless, absolutely priceless.
Yeah, I've used them more than once. Merriam-Webster is the one that always pops up where you can sort of rely on it, because there's a lot of dodgy pronunciations out there. What was the word I was trying to look up? Oh, I was just trying to look up Copernicus's first name and how you actually pronounce it. Is it Nicholas, Nicolaus, Nicolaus? Now, actually, the dictionary is not a good place to look for proper nouns and pronunciations. But I found one website that had 8 different pronunciations, including Copernicus, which I'm pretty sure isn't right in any sense. So that is how technology has really, fundamentally changed the job that you do.
Oh, absolutely. And kind of on, both going and coming. The research part is radically different, much faster. I'm the bridge generation, because when I started here, everything was on paper. All revision, all typesetting, all proofreading was all done on paper, but also all research was done on paper. There was no internet, and so now with not just corpus linguistics, but databases of literature and of letters, the relaxed language of the private correspondence of, for example, the founding fathers, so-called founding fathers of the United States, is an incredible richness, because what you find is an unguarded Thomas Jefferson will use this word in this meaning, that he's not writing, the Bill of Rights or the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. He's just writing a letter. And so those kinds of correspondences that are now searchable online of Mark Twain or Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, they are an unbelievable richness of resource for a lexicographer. And so from my chair, from my laptop, I can go and look at how a word was used in the 17th century, or how it was used in a certain geographical region as well. And so there's just no end to what we can do. Of course, what that really does is make our job a lot bigger, because now we can try to, bite off more than we can chew, really, to try to bring everything into the dictionary. And so getting back to your question, yes, we can allow for more words to be entered, because we can do that research a little bit more securely, more quickly, and with a lot of confidence. We can say, hey, here's a word that was used a very little bit 20 years ago, and now it's used constantly. So we can map that trajectory. We can, define it. We can prove that it's a common word, and that you're likely to encounter such a word, and therefore it absolutely has a place in the dictionary.
Have you thought about how the next big technological revolution, in fact, I say the current technological revolution that we're already going through, artificial intelligence is going to affect your job, whether it's going to make it easier or whether it's going to threaten it, full stop?
I think it's important to say that, lexicographers make lousy prognosticators, that we do a very old-fashioned thing. But as it happens, we do something that is that requires editorial judgment. The hardest words to define are not words like sesquipedalian the hardest words to define are words like get and set and run, and in, the function words. And AI is not going to do a good job at separating, the different definitions of the verb set, which I believe is the longest entry in our unabridged dictionary. And it goes after column after column after column. And as you know, for the OED, page after page after page for words like run. And so the human, sort of the human organ that language is, will always need human interpretation. And even though an algorithm can help with, for example, discovering new words, one of my favorite Twitter accounts is the account that identifies a new string of letters that is printed in the New York Times. And so it is, in other words, the first occurrence of such a word in the New York Times, which I think is a great use of technology. Obviously, no person could do that. That's what AI is for. That is what an algorithm is for, and that's hugely helpful. But I think what you also need is editorial judgment. And what I mean by that is, for example, when we used a corpus to do an entirely new dictionary, entirely with 21st century research, which was a dictionary made for learners of English. We call it Merriam-Webster's Advanced Learners English Dictionary. And it's online for free. It's actually the dictionary at Britannica.com. So if you go to Britannica.com and click dictionary, you get that wonderful learner's dictionary entirely from scratch, entirely from 21st century corpus information. But if you use a corpus, as people started to in the 90s, when people had stars in their eyes and said, oh, we have a corpus, we're going to make a better dictionary now. A corpus is also dumb. A corpus requires interpretation. In other words, a corpus is going to give you the published writing, not the informal writing, not the household language. And so what I noticed right away is if you have a corpus that is transcripts of the United Nations or of the New York Times or of important journalists or journalism or academic journals or medical journals or math journals, which were the kind of early things that we had digitized. A basic word like elbow just doesn't appear very often in the New York Times, except in the context of like sports injury. And so what you realize is the parts of the body are essential for learning a language. You need to know those parts, and they automatically need to be defined. But if you use a corpus frequency check as your arbiter for inclusion, there will be very common words like drain, like in a sink or a shower drain. Those are words that they don't show up a lot in the proportion of importance to our daily lives that we actually require. They are not accounted for in printed English. So I think a corpus is a great tool, but it needs to be combined with editorial judgment and simply sound a common sense lexicography, which says, you know what, we need the word, elbow or, different parts of the body, household things that may not make the news, but absolutely require definitions.
What about the fact that the future is going to contain a lot of texts that have been written by artificial intelligence, bots like ChatGPT, for example? The practice that you're used to, I imagine, as lexicographers is, trawling for texts and seeing what words are in there, what words are getting used. But that's before now always been texts written by human beings. So if a word is in very common usage, but actually it's robots that are using it most of the time, isn't that going to confound your process somehow?
Well, it certainly would. It certainly would, and it makes me think of the way that English as a very global language has changed with Indian English or with the Englishes of the world that use words in different ways, and so now we're adding a new ingredient, a new kind of element to the census taking that we have to do for research. It's not something I've thought a lot about because you're right. We've always basically had a premise that this is organic text, that this is maybe professionally edited, but certainly written by a person for other people to understand. Things like Google Translate, of course, are miracles of technology. At the same time, I've been hearing that translators will be out of work for about 35 years. And I've heard it every year since I was in college, and it's still not true. It can certainly help and it can accelerate the process, but you're never going to get I think, an adequate translation of any serious text, any literature or any scientific text that is just automated. It will have to be, the funny thing about human language is it is always going to be human. We can only kind of imitate it up to a point, and that's why we have things like certain tests to test whether you're conversing with a human with a human being. And so again, AI is new and it's flashy, but I think its use in schools as a matter of homework assignments for learners or for students whose writing is already unformed and being kind of developed. I think that is a more immediate worry. That's something that we really have to address, because this could really interfere with education, obviously, because it actually short circuits education. But in terms of lexicography, I don't know yet how that is going to land. Our job is still very much a handmade product. It has to be. And even a term as clear as COVID-19, but there are so many terms that are less clear that require human interpretation.
So now I'm wondering how the AI bots are going to use irregardless. Peter Sokolowski, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for bringing us your insights here.
It's a treat to be with you. Thank you.
Wasn't he great? Peter Sokolowski there. I'm still reeling from his little fact about the word fabulous, originally meaning from a fable. He just tossed that out there like it was nothing. If you enjoyed listening to him, then you'll enjoy listening to his podcast, Word of the Day from Merriam-Webster. There's a new one every day. And if you've enjoyed this video, I think you'll enjoy my video here about ghost words, so the fake words that made it into the dictionary. But if you've already seen that, why not try this one? And I'll see you over there.